heroin,
methamphetamine,
mushrooms,
marijuana,
MDMA,
cocaine,
opium,
tobacco,
alcohol.
mind-altering experiences.
Why do we take drugs? Many of us take drugs to feel good.
I mean, there's legalized drugs and illegal drugs.
Some of them are synthetic in origin, some are natural in origin.
What are they? How do they work?
A drug is a small molecule that has an effect on the body.
any chemical that impacts the brain.
A drug is something that treats a medical condition.
And some medications are abused drugs.
Technology is allowing us to actually look inside the human brain.
As we learn more about the brain, we'll also learn more about how it functions with drugs of abuse.
Weed, ganja, Mary Jane, pot. Marijuana is the flowering part of the Indian hemp plant, Cannabis sativa. Cannabis is a weed-like species that grows wild and is cultivated in many tropical and temperate parts of the world. For thousands of years, it has been used as a recreational drug, an edible seed, and a medicine. One variety of the hemp plant that has little or no drug value was grown as a cash crop over the centuries in the United States and abroad, and was used to make linens and papers, as well as ropes and sails for many of the world's ships. The first medical use of marijuana can be traced back to ancient China and India, but it wasn't until much later that it became a medical additive in the United States.
Marijuana was actually introduced into the United States in the late 1800s, and it was seen as a potential ingredient in patent medicines for sinus issues. And it was lumped in and included with the other products during this whole patent medicine industry. And people didn't understand the potential abuse and addiction problems with the drugs. And so in 1906 and again in 1914, controls began to be put in place to regulate these products.
All sorts of excessive behavior became associated with marijuana. Movies like Reefer Madness portrayed many of these deviant behaviors. And though they were known to be greatly exaggerated, for many, it was proof that marijuana was a menace to society.
It wasn't until 1937 that the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. And the Tax Act said that marijuana needed to be taxed in order to be controlled.
This act, along with other legal restrictions, created the conditions that led to the removal of cannabis as a prescribed drug in 1941, and led to the end of the once prosperous hemp industry by the 50s. But despite these restrictions, marijuana use spread to cultural subgroups.
When you look back at drug history in the United States, you can't talk about drug abuse without talking about the cultural impacts that it had. In the 1930s and 40s, marijuana had a significant cultural impact on the jazz scene. The 1960s and 70s, obviously the counterculture movements of the time are directly linked to the feeling that by overusing certain drugs, that would have, some mind-altering experiences.
Within the last 30 years, medical research has discovered new and potentially beneficial effects of marijuana, and more specifically the active ingredient, THC. It has been found to reduce eye pressure for people suffering from glaucoma, and also reduce nausea.
Marijuana, or cannabis sativa, has an active ingredient, THC, and that has been synthesized out of marijuana and is available as a prescription drug.
THC is actually a active ingredient in a drug called Marinol. A pharmaceutical company has taken THC, but they've synthetically derived it rather than getting it out of a marijuana plant. And this is used to treat nausea related to appetite, that tries to increase your appetite, with people that have AIDS and cancer.
Today, Marijuana has the distinction of being the most widely used illicit drug in the United States and has had this top ranking for at least 25 years. The chemical compounds primarily responsible for the psychoactive and medical properties of the cannabis plant are known as cannabinoids.
When we talk about cannabinoids, we're talking primarily about tetrahydrocannabinol. Tetrahydrocannabinol is the active compound in marijuana. So when we talk about cannabinoids, we're typically talking about marijuana or pot.
Tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, is found in buds and flowers of the marijuana plant, and also in the resin found in hash oil and hashish blocks. THC is considered a psychoactive drug, meaning it is a mind-altering drug which affects thoughts, mood perceptions, and behavior.
THC is considered a hallucinogen, but it also does reduce inhibitions, and it does have some relaxing qualities about it.
Marijuana affects these behaviors in a variety of ways, and they vary from person to person. Some factors that contribute are your environment, your setting and your mood, the dose, how much you use, and the route of administration, how you use the drug, or how it gets into your system. Cannabis is usually smoked as a cigarette, a joint, or in a pipe or bong, but it can also be baked into foods and ingested. These are the ways the drug gets to the brain.
And the faster a drug gets to the brain, the faster its effects are going to be and the more serious its effects are going to be. So orally it has to go through your stomach, it has to go through all of these processes. That makes it take longer to get into the brain and decreases the amount of drug that actually gets to the brain.
Smoking a drug is one of the fastest, most efficient routes of administration.
When you smoke marijuana, the marijuana smoke goes into your lungs, and then it's fed into your bloodstream, and then it goes into your brain and other parts of your body.
Euphoria, anxiety, hunger, laughter. Once marijuana gets into your system, a variety of short-term effects can occur.
It affects your memory, it affects problem solving, it affects your coordination. So if you're driving a car, you're not able to control it as much anymore.
Other short-term physical effects include increased heart rate, dry mouth, and hunger. Typical psychological effects are increased sensory experiences, like to music, but also confusion, anxiety, and paranoia.
After someone has smoked a joint or used a bong, they can become extremely paranoid. Now this paranoia manifests in many ways. They'll leave the room completely. They'll become aggressive. It's not uncommon to see people who smoke pot become very aggressive as a result of being so paranoid. Now the other thing that we see, it's not as common, but we do see it, are almost schizophrenic-like symptoms where they'll hear voices, they'll become delusional, they'll think that people aren't who they really are, that they're not where they think they are. So there's a delusional component to it that I think is probably related more to dose than it is to anything else.
Eaten or smoked, the effects we associate with marijuana depend greatly on the dose.
Of course, there's different doses of marijuana depending on the plant and where the marijuana comes from. And in some cases, of course, that dose can vary dramatically. Oftentimes with drugs, your ability to know exactly what the dose of the drug is for someone who uses it is not always precise. That dose may vary.
Well, one of the things which we've observed over time is that marijuana has had an increase in concentration in THC. We call it more potent.
One of the interesting facts we know is marijuana today is about 200 times more potent than marijuana in the 60s. So they've grown it hydroponically, they've concentrated the THC, and they're consuming more of it, and it produces these psychiatric symptoms that can be striking.
Drugs do not contain highs, they trigger them. THC is a highly psychoactive chemical that activates the cannabinoid receptors in the brain.
The cannabis receptors exist all over the brain, and actually it's really interesting. The receptor for marijuana, which is the cannabis system in our brains, was only discovered about 15 years ago. So we've only known about the brain receptors for marijuana, for cannabis, for a short period of time. We've known about opiate receptors for 60, 70 years, and we've known about cocaine receptors and so forth for quite a while, whereas marijuana is a pretty new field for science to be studying. But it certainly produces some of the same brain changes and brain chemical changes that we see with the other substances.
I hear a lot that marijuana doesn't have any effect in the brain. In fact, that nothing could be further from the truth. It has profound effects on the brain. First of all, it raises brain dopamine.
One of the ways marijuana produces such a great sense of euphoria, or pleasure, is by increasing the chemical in the brain called dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is naturally released in the brain when you do something pleasurable. Scientists call this the reward pathway. This is essential for our survival in that it creates an appetite that drives us to seek important things in our environment.
So it's a very important part of the brain because it tells us you need to eat, you need to reproduce. These are all things that you need to sleep. These are all good, important things that if you don't do, you won't survive or you won't pass on your genes. So it's a very important region of the brain. Well, all drugs of abuse tap into that region. So what they do is they activate the reward area, but to a much greater degree than all those natural rewards.
What results is that an area of the brain that might normally release a small amount of dopamine as a response to a pleasant experience will get a huge influx of dopamine as a reaction to taking the drug.
So now all of a sudden, that part of the brain says, wow, this is important. This is something I need to keep doing if I want to survive.
And all of the drugs of abuse seem to stimulate those pathways in similar ways. And that's what makes it tricky, is these are normal brain pathways that are kind of taken advantage of and used by drugs of abuse.
Drugs hijack pre-existing systems. We're learning what those systems are. In the case of THC, we found the receptors where marijuana binds to first before we found out what are the chemicals that in the brain that the brain naturally produces.
THC binds to the natural cannabinoid receptors throughout the brain, where it mimics the actions of naturally produced chemicals, known as endocannabinoids.
These are cannabinoid-type chemicals that the brain produces itself. And these are, similar to THC, and that's why they bind to the same receptor.
The long-term health effects of marijuana and THC are still being studied. However, there is much evidence that points to the damage to the respiratory system and lungs, because smoking is the preferred method of getting high.
Marijuana has over 400 chemicals in it, so toxic chemicals. It's as bad as tobacco, if not worse, because people inhale large amounts and then hold it for a while. Then it can cause asthma and respiratory problems, much like tobacco can cause.
Along with respiratory problems, marijuana can have long-term effects on the heart, the immune system, and the reproductive system by altering a part of the brain called the hypothalamus.
Now, the hypothalamus plays an important role in feeding behavior, appetite, and hormone release. So as we go through puberty, as we age, our bodies change. The reason our bodies change is because our brain is releasing hormones that's making our bodies change. Now, when you smoke marijuana, you alter the hypothalamus. When you alter the hypothalamus, you alter hormone release. When you alter hormone release, you disturb, in very profound ways, changes as we go through puberty. So you can accelerate it, you can stop it, you can sometimes reverse it.
The hypothalamus also controls the feeding center in the brain, so marijuana changes your appetite.
It's very common to hear kids talk about they get the munchies after they smoke marijuana. The reason they get the munchies is because they're altering the feeding center in the hypothalamus. So when you start to alter the feeding center in the hypothalamus, and you do so chronically, that is over long periods of time, you produce changes in feeding behavior. So these can be manifest in terms of obesity. They can be manifest in terms of anorexia nervosa. So there are consequences that we see from chronic marijuana use.
Many researchers point out that THC damages the way the brain senses and processes information, suggesting that learning and memory are affected by marijuana use.
There, the research is still, not completely delineated, but there's a lot of papers that report memory performance is impacted.
In addition, as a clinician, I've seen people become addicted to marijuana just like they are to other substances. And I think that kind of surprises the public. They just don't think it's addictive, and yet I can point to many, many patients I've had that have had addiction to marijuana.
Absolutely, marijuana is an addictive drug. We define addiction by a very rigid set of criteria. Marijuana meets all the criteria for an addictive drug. So these can include withdrawal, anxiety, craving, environmental triggered relapse, and organic changes in the brain that are measurable, in this case, in the dopamine system.
Whether somebody becomes addicted to a drug varies from person to person, drug to drug, as well as other contributing factors.
It could be individual differences, so everybody's genetic makeup is different. The way everybody responds to a drug, any drug, is different.
If I give everyone chocolate chip cookies, is everyone going to respond the same way? I guarantee you not everyone is going to feel the same effect of a chocolate chip cookie. Well, not that a drug like THC is a chocolate chip cookie, but your response is going to vary.
Scientists believe that some people may produce more natural highs than others, or may have more sensitive receptors. And perhaps those who do not produce as many receptors find marijuana, and other drugs like it, particularly pleasant, and therefore may come to rely on them.
We all have natural levels of dopamine receptors. And we don't really understand why they vary, but I guarantee that they do vary across individuals.
One thing we know is that the brain is still developing until you're in your early 20s. So if you're affecting that brain development, that could cause problems for the future. But we also know that because the brain is still developing, that's why kids tend to take more risks. And so there's kind of a double-edged sword there. I mean, it's designed that way because you want to take risks when you're young. That's how you learn. But at the same time, if you're in the environment where these are the risks you're going to take, then you could have a lot more serious consequences.
Marijuana continues to be a subject of great debate in this country. The use of medical marijuana, the decriminalization or legalization. Some feel marijuana is not only safe, but holds great potential as a prescription drug. However, expert opinions remain sharply divided over the health and behavioral risks of using marijuana.
The chronic effects of these drugs on brain chemistry and on brain function have largely been unexplored. And so it's very important for scientists to continue with that research and present it to the public so that they can understand what are the effects of these very widely used and abused drugs on the brain and its function. And what are the long-term effects of this?